Welcome everyone to Fire Emblem Month. For this entire month of July, I'm going to be talking about all the games in the series that I have played because they are all fantastic RPGs. And with that out of the way, let us begin. The Fire Emblem series has become one of Nintendo's most popular franchises behind the lines of Mario, Zelda, and Pokemon now. Each game in this series is a stellar RPG and one of the best games on their respective consoles. However, Fire Emblem wasn't represented in the West until the appearance of Marth and Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Because of the series' growing popularity, several other Japanese Fire Emblem games have been translated into English for the rest of the world. And this leads to my first reviewed game of this month. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is the fourth installment in the Fire Emblem series and the second on the Super Famicom. This game is widely considered to be the best in the franchise by the fan base. And you know what? I think it kinda deserves that recognition. Let's find out why that is. Genealogy of the Holy War takes place in the continent of Yggdrasil, where Granvelle is at war with the kingdom of Isaac because of some Rivo barbarians who besieged Darna Castle. The game is followed within two storylines: Sigurd, a royal lord of Granvelle, and his son, Seliph. The game starts with Sigurd as he rides out to aid other allies in another part of Granvelle. Sigurd gathers several allies, some of whom are part of the 12 Crusaders. Later in the game, we follow the story of Seliph and his half-sister Julia, who have come out of hiding after being exiled in an attempt to stop Arvis and Lokter so that they can end their rule and the war can be done for good. The story is rather basic but gets more complex as you progress through the game, though it isn't perfect, but I'll get to that later. Gameplay mechanics from Genealogy differ from many other Fire Emblem games and makes the game one of a kind. First off, there's the sheer scope of the game. The game has about 12 chapters in its main story, including the prologue and epilogue. Sure, that may be a little short, but these maps are massive. Unlike in most Fire Emblem games, the main objective for each map in Genealogy is to capture several castles from the enemy. You also have a castle in your possession and cannot be captured by the enemy. In allied castles, players can either shop, fight in the arena, or even repair your weapons. Also, the starting castle is the only way that fighters can promote. There is no limit into how many player characters can be deployed. This is balanced by the player receiving fewer units than in any other Fire Emblem game. I appreciate the map structure and how massive they are, so that you can prepare yourself ahead of time before the enemy can dogpile you, like repairing your weapons, promoting to advanced classes, etc. The second thing that must be noted is the generation format. In Genealogy, the game is divided into two different story arcs, kind of like Book 1 and Book 2 from Mystery of the Emblem. But unlike that feature from Mystery of the Emblem, stats and character pairings are directly influenced by the first generation of units. Here's what I mean by this. If a woman and a man in the first generation marry each other, then their children, one boy and one girl, will help out Seliph on his journey. Stats are dependent on their parents. If a woman does not marry someone in the first generation, there will be two substitute characters, but they will be much weaker because of the second generation units' stats depending on their parents. So you might as well better use that lover's mechanic hard in the first generation. Otherwise you're pretty much screwed. I really like this mechanic as it's rather unique and has never been done before in the series to this extent. Finally, there's the special skills system. Fire Emblem 4 was actually the first Fire Emblem game to assign special skills to individual characters, unlike in the West where it was introduced in Path of Radiance. I really like how this system was used and how it became a core mechanic within the Fire Emblem series. There are also several other mechanics in all Fire Emblem games, like visiting villages, the arena, the weapon triangle, etc. But I also must appreciate the game's production values, more specifically, Genealogy of the Holy War's soundtrack. For Super Famicom standards, the game has a rather energetic and epic soundtrack of points, and the characters are mostly okay with the exception of characters like Sigurd, Ira, Lewin, Seliph, and especially one of the villains, Arvis, who are all really well-written characters. So anyways, with all this praise I'm giving the game, you'd think that Fire Emblem 4 has to be either the best game in the series, or even one of the best RPGs ever. And I wish that were the case, but you couldn't be further from the truth. Now I'm just gonna say right now that, no, Genealogy is not a bad game, in fact I think it's a delightful game and a rather great RPG. But this game has severely aged poorly, and I'm gonna tell you why. The biggest problem I personally have with this game is the map structure and level design. Now in Genealogy's defense, when you start the game, you start at your castle and you can't be bombarded by the enemy on the very first turn, and gives you enough preparation ahead of time. But because the maps are so large, the game can become rather tedious at points and be very long. So you might want to use that save button very often, cause if you lose some units and have to restart the chapter, you may have lost hours upon hours of progress. Another issue I have involving the level design is the enemy placement, as there can be a crap ton of enemies on screen, and sometimes you just can't handle them all. Because you don't have as many units as in, say, Awakening and Fates, the odds are certainly not in your favor. Not to mention that this is one of the hardest games to not lose a unit. Don't get me wrong, they're not strong individually, but together in a large horde like this, they can be rather difficult as they will bombard single units at a time. The next big problem I have with this game is the pacing of the story. The story is great without a doubt, but the pacing is rather annoying. But to give this game credit, the first few chapters of this game really flow very well and give you an introduction to the story. But later on, the story is rather forced and happens way too quickly. And while there are other things that I feel aren't as bad, still have flaws to me. The first one being the presentation, more specifically, the character portraits. To be honest, the battle animations look just fine. But the character portraits just look... to me. To put it lightly, it looks way outdated and odd. So yeah, the presentation lacks in execution and looks blech. Alright, before I give my general thoughts, there is one moment I have to address, and it is one of the most memorable and well-known moments in Fire Emblem. So if you don't want to be spoiled, click on this time frame. You've been warned. If you've been paying attention, you already know there's a second generation of characters you play as. But you also gotta wonder what happens to the first generation of fighters, as well as Sigurd, Seliph's father. Well, The reason for this is actually really tragic and horrific. Sigurd's life is nothing but a tragedy. It starts bad and gets overall worse. He gets one moment of happiness when he meets the love of his life, Deidre, as it was love at first sight. And we all know how those go, right? Then his life goes to hell and beyond as he is then manipulated by Arvis, the ruler of another kingdom, who wants to wipe out all oppositions and become emperor unopposed. Later on, Deidre gets kidnapped after giving birth to Seliph, just to have her memory of Sigurd be wiped from her mind. Only to have Deidre sent to Lord Arvis, in which she marries him, who also happens to be her half-brother. Okay, I'm facing a bunch of incest right now, and it's pretty messed up. However, the worst of all of this is laid out in Chapter 5, the last chapter you play as Sigurd. Every part of this chapter is like having a punch to the gut. It first starts off with Sigurd trying to save his father when he's fleeing from the enemy, only for him to die right in Sigurd's hands or on his way there. Either way, Sigurd's father dies, and it just gets worse from there. After you claim the first castle, his sister Ethlyn and her husband Quan come down to the bottom end of the map in order to help Sigurd grab their new baby girl. So what happens next? A group of dragon riders from Thracia chase them down and slaughter all of them before capturing the baby princess. There is nothing you can do to prevent this. And just to rub more salt in the wound, the dragon riders are unable to be targeted because they are neutral enemies. It's even worse for the fact that Sigurd is unable to see his sister before she is slaughtered by the Thracian Dragon Knights. He only hears it secondhand at the next castle. And finally, when Sigurd reaches the final castle, things actually start looking up as Velthamir's army turns on their own allies to let Sigurd reach the final castle. And from there, the crew is brought before Arvis in what seems to be a celebration, until only for Arvis to declare Sigurd a traitor and for him to be executed for his actions against his own kingdom. And to rub even more salt in your wound, Arvis brings out Deidre, who he's just married her, and Sigurd's last thing he'll ever see is the girl he's loved for his entire life, and she doesn't even know who he is. Sigurd is declared a traitor to his country and executed by a fire spell for treason, and for the last thing he sees is the love of his life, who is married to his executioner. This chapter is one of the most memorable and heart-wrenching in all of Fire Emblem, not for just what happened, but for how it happened. The game sets it up enough time and time again for that desperate chance that there is shimmering hope. But that's not the case. Rescuing Sigurd's father, Ethlyn and Quan trying to help them out on the scene, only for you to be stabbed in the back every single time. All of this makes Arvis, in my opinion, one of the most well-written characters and villains in general in the Fire Emblem series. He doesn't want to rule just for power, but he's trying to protect his country as he thinks this is the best solution to everything. And though he's being manipulated in the background by an evil cult, he never strays away from his ideals and motivations. Alright, time to give my overall verdict. What do I think of Genealogy of the Holy War personally? Well, I think Fire Emblem 4 is good. Really good. But not great. The technical gameplay mechanics and unique features really make this game one of a kind. But the overall aesthetics of the game, except the soundtrack, is where the game is at its weakest. I even forgot to mention that mounted units are the only viable class in the game, since after they attack, they can move away from the enemy, unlike the infantrymen, which really sucks. But overall, based on my personal experience, Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War is a really good Fire Emblem game, a really good RPG, and would most definitely appear in my top 10 favorite Fire Emblem games. If that list were to happen, mind you. But that is it for my first review, and I hope you all really enjoyed it. And next time, we'll be here taking a look at the last game that appeared on the Super Famicom.